Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea, in and for itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notation. Encyclopedia Section 19. Logic is the science of the pure idea. Pure, that is, because the idea is in the abstract medium of thought. This definition and the others which occur in these introductory outlines are derived from a survey of the whole system, to which accordingly they are subsequent. The same remark applies to all prefatory notions whatever about philosophy. Logic might have been defined as the science of thought, and of its laws and characteristic forms, but thought, as thought, constitutes only the general medium or qualifying circumstance which renders the idea distinctively logical. If we identify the idea with thought, thought must not be taken in the sense of a method or form, but in the sense of the self-developing totality of its laws and peculiar terms. These laws are the work of thought itself, and not a fact which it finds it must submit to, and not a fact which it finds it must submit to. From different points of view, logic is either the hardest or the easiest of the sciences. Logic is hard because it has to deal not with perceptions, nor like geometry with abstract representations of the senses, but with pure abstractions, and because it demands a force and facility of withdrawing into pure thought, of keeping firm hold on it, and of moving in such an element. Logic is easy because its facts are nothing but our own thought, and its familiar forms are terms. And these are the acme of simplicity, the ABC of everything else. They are also what we are best acquainted with, such as is and is not, quality and magnitude, being potential and being actual, one, many, and so on. But such an acquaintance only adds to the difficulties of the study. For while, on the one hand, we naturally think it is not worth our trouble to occupy ourselves any longer with things so familiar, on the other hand, the problem is to become acquainted with them in a new way, quite opposite to that in which we know them already. The utility of logic is a matter which concerns its bearings upon the student and the training it may give for other purposes. This logical training, this logical training consists in the exercise in thinking which the student has to go through. This science is the thinking of thinking, and in the fact that he stores his head with thoughts in their native unalloyed character. It is true that logic, being the absolute form of truth, and another name for the very truth itself, is something more than mere useful. Yet, if what is noblest, most liberal, and most independent is also most useful, Logic has some claim to the latter character. Its utility must then be estimated at another rate than exercise in thought for the sake of exercise. Hegel, Encyclopedia Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, The Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia, Section 19, Infra, Section 1. The first question is, what is the object of our science? The simplest and most intelligible answer to this question is that truth is the object of logic. Truth is a noble word, and the thing is nobler still. So long as man is sound at heart and in spirit, the search for truth must awake all the enthusiasm of his nature. But immediately there steps in the objection. Are we able to know truth? There seems to be a disproportion between finite beings like ourselves and the truth which is absolute, and doubts suggest themselves whether there is any bridge between the finite and the infinite. God is truth. How shall we know him? Such an undertaking appears to stand in contradiction with the graces of lowliness and humanity. Others who ask whether we can know the truth have a different purpose. They want to justify themselves in living on contented with their petty, finite aims, and humility of this stamp is a poor thing. But the time is past when people asked, how shall I, a poor worm of the dust, be able to know the truth? And in its stead we find vanity and conceit. People claim, without any trouble on their part, to breathe the very atmosphere of truth. The young have been flattered into the belief that they possess a natural birthright of moral and religious truth, and in the same strain, those of riper years are declared to be sunk, petrified, ossified in falsehood. Youth, say these teachers, see the bright light of dawn, but the older generation lies in the slough and mire of the common day. They admit that the special sciences are something that certainly ought to be cultivated, but merely as the means to satisfy the needs of outer life. In all this, it is not humility which holds back from the knowledge and study of the truth, but a conviction that we are already in full possession of it. And no doubt the young carry with them the hopes of their elder compeers. On them rests the advance of the world and science. But these hopes are not set upon the young, only on the condition that they, instead of remaining as they undertake the stern labor of mind. This modesty in truth seeking has still another phase, and that is the genteel indifference to truth, as we see it in Pilate's conversation with Christ. Pilate asked, what is truth? With the air of a man who had settled accounts with everything long ago, and concluded that nothing particularly matters. He meant much the same as Prince Nathaniel, son of King David, when he says, all is vanity in Ecclesiastes, or the preacher. When it comes to this, nothing is left but self-conceit. The knowledge of the truth meets an additional obstacle in timidity. A slothful mind finds it natural to say, don't let it be supposed that we mean to be in earnest with our philosophy. We shall be glad, inter alia, to study logic, but logic must be sure to leave us as we were before. People have a feeling that if thinking passes the ordinary range of our ideas and impressions, it cannot but be on the road, it cannot but be on the evil road. They seem to be trusting themselves to a sea on which they will be tossed to and fro by the waves of thought, till at length they again reach the sandbank of this temporal scene, as utterly poor as when they left it. What coins of such a view we see in this world? What coins of such a view we see in this world? What coins of such a view we see in the world? It is possible within these limits to gain varied information and many accomplishments, to become a master of official routine, and to be trained for special purposes. But it is quite another thing to educate the spirit for the higher life and to devote our energies to its service. In our own day, it may be hoped a longing for something better has sprung up among the young, so that they will not be contented with the mere straw of outer knowledge. Hegel, Encyclopedia Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia Section 19, Logic is the Science of the Pure Idea, Infra Section 2. It is universally agreed that thought is the object of logic, but of thought our estimate may be very mean, or it may be very high. On one hand, people say it is only a thought. In their view, thought is subjective, arbitrary, and accidental, distinguished from the thing itself, from the true and the real. On the other hand, a very high estimate may be formed of thought when thought alone is held adequate to attain the highest of all things, the nature of God, of which the senses can tell us nothing. God is a spirit, it is said, and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. But the merely felt and sensible, we admit, is not the spiritual. Its heart of hearts is in thought, and only spirit can know spirit. And though it is true that spirit can demean itself as feeling and sense, as is the case in religion, the mere feeling as a mode of consciousness is one thing, and its contents another. Feeling as feeling is the general form of the sensuous nature which we have in common with the brutes. This form, these feeling, may possibly seize and appropriate the full organic truth, but the form has no real congruity with its contents. The form of feeling is the lowest in which spiritual truth can be expressed. The world of spiritual existences, God Himself, exists in proper truth, only in thought and as thought. If this be so, therefore, thought, far from being a mere thought, is the highest and, in strict accuracy, the sole mode of apprehending the eternal and absolute. As of thought, so also of the science of thought. A very high or a very low opinion may be formed. Any man, it is supposed, can think without logic, as he can digest without studying physiology. If he had studied logic, he thinks afterwards as he did before, perhaps more methodically, but with little alteration. If this were all, and if logic did no more than make men acquainted with the action of thought as the faculty of comparison and classification, it would produce nothing which had not been done quite as well as before. And in point of fact, logic hitherto had no other idea of its duty than this. Yet to be well informed about thought, even as a mere activity of the subject mind, is honorable and interesting for man. It is in knowing what he is and what he does that man is distinguished from the brutes. But we may take the higher estimate of thought as what alone can really in touch with the supreme and true. But we may take the higher estimate of thought as what alone can get really in touch with the supreme and true. In that case, logic as the science of thought occupies a high ground. If the science of logic then considers thought in its action and its productions, and thought being no resultless energy produces thoughts, and the particular thought required, the theme of logic is in general the supersensible world, and to deal with that theme is to dwell for a while in that world. Mathematics is concerned with the abstractions of time and space, but these are still the object of sense, although the sensible is abstract and idealized. Thought bids adieu even to this last and abstract sensible. It asserts its own native independence, renounces the field of the external and internal sense, and puts away the interests and inclinations of the individual. When logic takes this ground, it is a higher science than we are in the habit of supposing. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion. Encyclopedia, Section 19, Infra 3. Infra Section 3. The necessity of understanding logic in a deeper sense than as the science of the mere form of thought is enforced by the interests of religion and politics, of law and morality. In earlier days, men meant no harm by thinking. They thought away freely and fearlessly. They thought about God, about nature and the state, and they felt sure that a knowledge of the truth was obtainable through thought only, and not through the senses or any random ideas or opinions. But while they so thought, the principal ordinances of life began to be seriously affected by their conclusions. Thought deprived existing institutions of their force. Constitutions fell a victim to thought. Religion was assailed by thought. Firm religious beliefs, which had been always looked upon as revelations, were undermined, and in many minds the old faith was upset. The Greek philosophers, for example, became antagonists of the old religion and destroyed its beliefs. Philosophers were accordingly banished or put to death as revolutionists who had subverted religion and the state, two things which were inseparable. Thought, in short, made itself a power in the real world and exercised enormous influence. The matter ended by drawing attention to the influence of thought, and its claims were submitted to a more rigorous scrutiny by which the world professed to find that thought arrogated too much and was unable to perform what it had undertaken. It had not, people said, learned the real being of God, of nature and mind. It had not learned what the truth was. What it had done was to overthrow religion and the state. It became urgent, therefore, to justify thought with reference to the results it had produced. And it is this examination into the nature of thought and this justification which in recent times has constituted one of the main problems of philosophy. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for Itself, Chapter 2, Preliminary Notion, Encyclopedia Section 20. If we take our prima facie impression of thought, we find on examination first, metasection A, that in its usual subjective acceptation, thought is one out of many activities or faculties of the mind, coordinate with such others as sensation, perception, imagination, desire, volition, and the like. A note, in the Middle East, and I imagine also in Germany, a faculty is what we would call in the United States a college. So I attended the University of California, Los Angeles, and I was part of the College of History. In the Middle East or in Germany, you would say that you attended the University of Berlin and were part of the faculty of history. So for the mind to have faculties other than thought is like a university having colleges other than history, philosophy, biology, physics, etc. So the mind, Hegel is saying, is a university. One of its colleges or faculties is thought, and the others are sensation, perception, imagination, desire, volition, and the like. And one could, and maybe he will, discuss what it is that the College of Sensation or the faculty of perception or your major in imagination, desire, volition are composed of, as we are now discussing what thought is, as one of the faculties of the mind, which is our university. Back to thought. The product of this activity, the form or character peculiar to thought, is the universal, or in general, the abstract. Thought, regarded as an activity, may be accordingly described as the active universal, and since the deed, its product, is the universal once more, may be called a self-actualizing universal. Thought conceived as a subject, agent. Thought conceived as a subject, agent, is a thinker, and the subject existing as a thinker is simply denoted by the term I. The propositions giving an account of thought in this and the following sections are not offered as assertions or opinions of mine on the matter. But in these preliminary chapters, any deduction or proof would be impossible, and the statements may be taken as matters in evidence. Matters in evidence is a legal term before, well, As part of a trial, say you are suing someone in law for a breach of contract. You contracted to sell a piece of farmland in a certain area of a certain size, and with it, the structures on the farmland. And the individual who was going to buy it decided not to buy it after the time available for them to withdraw their consideration. At least that's your opinion. So, what you do before the jury sits down, the judge, you are your attorney as uh, the what we somewhat say accusing party. You sit down and say, I have evidence, primarily the contract itself, signed, hopefully notarized, and you may have email conversations. You may have recorded phone calls if they're legal to have. You may have your testimony in memory, and you may have witnesses who were there when you signed the contract or were part of the conversation. You may have had a broker or other people as well. So you submit this as matters in evidence, or to become matters in evidence, and the defendant, the person who has breached the contract, you argue, has also to present his or her information. They have a contract which may be different than the one you have. They may argue that there were no witnesses. They may have a different story than you. They may say everything that the accuser says is true, but the state allows me to withdraw from a contract after a certain time, even if the contract states differently. These are matters in evidence. And the ask is from both parties that you leave them in evidence until you reach the end of the trial. And then you take them back to the jury room, or the judge takes it back to his or her office and looks over the material, looks over the transcripts of the arguments, looks over the evidence. Some evidence is allowed, some is not allowed. There's a type of evidence called hearsay, which is, yes, I know that they signed a contract because I heard it from one of them or I heard it from someone else. Generally, this is called hearsay and is not admissible, though there are exceptions. So when Hegel here says matters in law through the pen of William Wallace, he means that he is submitting and is in the process of providing you evidence, but until he reaches the end of his argument, which he's acting also as the expert witness, and you hear it all as the finder of fact, you individual listening, or you classroom of people listening who may debate it or reading, you will be finders of fact, and you will decide with all the knowledge and information you gained. And he's saying that you will decide that these things are true, but he is in the process of explaining what true is and what truth is, and how we are we even worthy to know what truth is, and if we are worthy, what does it then mean that we know it? And so at this point, at the very beginning of the science of logic in the encyclopedia of philosophy, he is asking you to be a finder of fact. He's saying that you will agree with him. And for a couple hundred years now, many people have agreed with him, but they've taken his approach differently and applied it differently. So we call that precedent. Yes, Hegel has been found to be correct. And what he offers here, as we have come to understand it as truth, is correct. But I argue that it applies to my current case differently. So this is called, or in a unique way. So this is called precedent. I take Hegel as precedent that logic is useful, and therefore the logic of physics, which is something that, while it existed during its time, quantum physics is something we understand to only exist now. It's the physical reality, even though, and even as math, as he explained, mathematics of metaphysics. And you say metaphysics, and people think, well, what is that? And that's kind of what we're discussing now. But there are mathematical proofs and there are visual proofs of it with tools that we have. So they will apply Hegel to that. And now you have Hegel in evidence and whatever else you are offering on the table. And so people may read this, as I hope you're reading or listening, and say, okay, now that I understand, and when you get there, Hegel and his idea or his explanation of logic, I also am looking at your theory or proposed law of physics or government, and in taking Hegel as established precedent, I determine that what you've offered is logical or illogical. And this is how I've come to that using Hegel and evidence. But we can't do that yet until Hegel proves himself here, and then you can apply it to other things. This is the process of thinking about thought. Returning to the text. In other words, every man, when he thinks and considers his thoughts, will discover by the experience of his consciousness that they possess the character of universality, as well as the other aspects of thought to be afterwards enumerated. We assume, of course, that his powers of attention and abstraction have undergone a previous training, enabling him to observe correctly the evidence of his consciousness and his conceptions. This introductory exposition has already alluded to the distinction between sense, conception, and thought. As the distinction is of capital importance for understanding the nature and kinds of knowledge, it will help to explain matters if we here call attention to it. For the explanation of sense, the readiest method certainly is to refer to its external source, the organs of sense, but to name the organ does not help much to explain what is apprehended by it. The real distinction between sense and thought lies in this, that the essential feature of the sensible is individuality, and as the individual, which reduced to its simplest terms is the atom, is also a member of a group, sensible existence presents a number of mutually exclusive units. Of units, to speak in more definite and abstract formulae, which exist side by side with and after one another. Conception or picture thinking works with materials from the same sensuous source. Somatics in Scientology. But these materials, when conceived, are expressly characterized as in me and therefore mine, and secondly, as universal or simple, because only referred to self, nor is sense the only source of materialized conception. There are conceptions constituted by materials emanating from self conscious thought, such as those of law, morality, religion, and even of thought itself. And it requires some effort to detect wherein lies the difference between such conceptions and thoughts having the same import. For it is a thought of which such conception is the vehicle, and there is no want of the form of universality without which no content could be in me or be a conception at all. Yet here also the peculiarity of conception is, generally speaking, to be sought in the individualism or isolation of its contents. True it is that, for example, law and legal provisions do not exist in a sensible space, mutually excluding one another, nor as regards time, though they appear to some extent in succession. Are their contents themselves conceived as affected by time, or as transient and changeable in it? The fault in conception lies deeper. These ideas, though implicitly possessing the organic unity of mind, stand isolated here and there on the broad ground of conception, with its inward and abstract generality, thus cut adrift. Each is simple, unrelated. Right, duty, God. Conception in these circumstances either rests satisfied with declaring that right is right, God is God, or in a higher grade of culture, it proceeds to enunciate the attributes, as, for instance, God is the creator of the world, omniscient, almighty, and similar, omnipotent, etc. In this way, several isolated, simple predicates are strung together, but in spite of the link supplied by their subject, the predicates never get beyond mere contiguity or contiguity. Contiguity. In this way, several isolated, simple predicates are strung together, but in spite of the link supplied by their subject, the predicates never get beyond mere contiguity. In this point, conception coincides with understanding, the only distinction being that the latter introduces relations of universal and particular, of course and effect, and similar, and in this way supplies a necessary connection to the isolated ideas of conception, which last has left them side by side in its vague mental spaces, connected only by a bare and, and. The difference between conception and thought is of special importance, because philosophy may be said to do nothing but transform conceptions into thoughts, though it works the further transformation of a mere thought into a sensation. Sensible existence has been characterized by the attributes of individuality and mutual exclusion of the members. It is well to remember that these very attributes of sense are thoughts and general terms. It will be shown in the logic that thought and the universal is not a mere opposite of sense. It lets nothing escape it, but outflanking its other, is at once that other and itself. Now language is the work of thought, and hence all that is expressed in language must be universal. What I only mean or suppose is mine. It belongs to me, this particular individual, but language expresses nothing but universality, and so I cannot say what I merely mean. And the unutterable, feeling or sensation, far from being the highest truth, is the most unimportant and untrue. If I say the individual, this individual, here, now, all these are universal terms. Everything and anything is an individual, a this, and if it be sensible, is here and now. Similarly, when I say I mean my single self to the exclusion of all others. But what I say, viewed as I, is just every I, which in like manner excludes all others from itself. In an awkward expression which Kant used, he said that I accompany all my conceptions, sensations to desires, actions, and like things. I is in essence and act the universal, and such partnership is a form, though an external form, of universality. All other men have it in common with me to be I, just as it is common to all my sensations and conceptions to be mine. But I, in the abstract, as such, is the mere act of self-concentration or self-relation in which we make abstraction from all conception and feeling, from every state of mind and every peculiarity of nature, talent, and experience. To this extent, I is the existence of a wholly abstract universality, a principle of abstract freedom. Hence, thought, viewed as a subject, is what is expressed by the word I. And since I am at the same time in all my sensations, conceptions, and states of consciousness, thought is everywhere present, and is a category that runs through all these modifications. Our first impression when we use the term thought is of a subjective activity, one amongst many similar faculties, such as memory, imagination, and will. Were thought merely an activity of the subject mind and treated under that aspect by logic, logic would resemble the other sciences in possessing a well marked object. It might in that case seem arbitrary to devote a special science to thought, whilst will, imagination, and the rest were denied the same privilege. The selection of one faculty, however, might even in this view be well. The selection of one faculty, however, might even in this view be very well grounded on a certain authority acknowledged to belong to thought, and on its claim to be regarded as the true nature of man, in which consists his distinction from the brutes. Nor is it unimportant to study thought even as a subjective energy. A detailed analysis of its nature would exhibit rules and laws, a knowledge of which is derived from experience, a treatment of the laws of thought. From this point of view, used once to form the body of logical science. Of that science, Aristotle, was the founder. He succeeded in assigning to thought what properly belongs to it. Our thought is extremely concrete, but in its composite content, we must distinguish the part that properly belongs to thought, or to the abstract mode of its action. A subtle spiritual bond, yalatif, consisting in the agency of thought, is what gives unity to all these contents. And it was this bond, the form as form, that Aristotle noted and described. Up to the present day, the logic of Aristotle continues to be the received system. A pause to note two things. When speaking of Plato, Aristotle, and Iamblichus, they are often called divine. Divine Plato, divine Aristotle, divine Iamblichus. Just as you would say His Highness, His Majesty, Prophet, uh, his holiness, they are considered divine, and divine has a particular meaning within philosophy. But it is the meaning that we tend to understand now. They've reached within a certain hierarchy system a level that is divine. So you have humans, which are at level 2, and then above humans are daemons, daemons, and above daemons are what we may call angels or gods. And below humans are demons, demons. Somewhere between, or so in humans and daemons, both can be heroes. Heroes, now we call superheroes or avengers or others. They are category of Greek conception of what is possible for a sentient being to be. So Plato and Aristotle, divine Plato, divine Aristotle, divine Iamblichus, are at least daemons, and if not, they may be, well, they're daemons. I think that's where we would stop with it. In today's Catholic Church, it to be a saint it's to in a way become a daemon. And what can you do with a daemon? A daemon can be definitely their words are listened to, their sciences that they put down, what has come down from them, are considered more eminent, more true, more important than others. They would be considered, if in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic standpoint, and maybe even some of the Buddhists and others, well, in the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, also the Abrahamic faith standpoint, they would be similar to prophets. Many would argue that they are similar to prophets who uh, were given scriptures to deliver. It is said that Socrates had a daemon that he, or even a demon, some people debate which one, that he heard from. And some people would say a spirit or Holy Spirit that conveyed something to him. Some people would say it's his nous or his mind, but his mind, as you would learn in the philosophy of mind, can be a world mind, a universal mind, or his own unique mind he would consider it outside of himself, though connected. So uh, sometimes we would say divine Aristotle, arguing that he is a daemon or a saint. And there may be rituals, though I haven't come across them yet, in which you could seek divine intervention. I think Aristotle would say you would seek divine intervention with his knowledges that he's offered you, and by going to them, you would have a better understanding of what to do. Uh, Whereas Iamblichus has offered in his correspondences, in his writings, his teachings, very intricate ways in which you are to approach every category of being that exists, what their rituals are, what their etiquettes are, and how to interact with them, including the divines, including himself. So that's on what they're considered to an Aristotelian. That's why Hegel goes to such an extent to talk about God and God existing and God being real, whatever he may have been called. In other sense, Plato discusses the good, but the good is synonymous with freedom. And we may say that God is the most free and therefore is the one who experiences most good or is the cause of good. Now, it also goes on to say, up to this day, Hegel goes on to say, up to the present day, the logic of Aristotle continues to be the received system. What is the received system? This is when we need to discuss two terms. One is perennialism, and a perennial flower is one that is not in bloom all year, but returns at a certain time to bloom. One of the most famous, and in the Norse tradition, especially the Finnish, infamous is the mistletoe. And the mistletoe is a perennial. It is a green plant throughout most of the year, uh, maybe, and then it buds with red fruit. And why is the mistletoe, to give you a bit of Norse trivia, why is the mistletoe so important? Well, there was a son born to the Lady Frigga and to Othin or Odin. His name is known to be Balder the Beautiful. He is akin to Apollo or the sun, and he was known to be the most beloved person in all of Asgard. And one thing that the Lady Frigga asked, very similar to Achilles, Achilles was being not a son of Hera, but of Zeus, but granted the ability to have immortality. His mother was told to dip him in the waters of life where she couldn't touch it and to remove him out of it. So she pinched the heel of his foot, the very back of his foot, and dipped him all the way in and then pulled him up, whereas that one part of him, his heel, was not invincible. In the case of Balder, the Lady Frigga, who is the queen of the Norns, the Fates in Greek tradition, went around to every form of creation and asked it to never harm Balder. And they all agreed except for one, the mistletoe. Mistletoe did not agree to not harm Balder. And the Lady Frigga said, well, we don't see why that will be a concern later. So she went back, and so Balder was invincible, except that and so most people would argue out of jealousy, but in general, just to kind of joke with him in a way that people do, that is rude and seditious, they would throw things at him. And you find many pictures of Balder, called Balder the Beautiful, with people shooting arrows at him and him just kind of shining with a glow. So he's taking all of their criticism and taking all of their literal arrows at him, and they're bouncing off. Maybe like Wolverine, he experiences pain, but he doesn't die. And Loki, if you've watched any of the Marvel series, his role is as a trickster. It is often said that the Asgardians uh, find themselves in a bind, in trouble, and Loki comes up with a solution, but the solution is always less than ideal. It's ideal in that it gets them out of the greater trouble, but it leaves some smaller trouble in place. Uh, for instance, when there was a need to build a wall around Asgard, they found a giant, the gods of Asgard, found a giant uh, to do the work, and he had a massive horse. So Loki, who is the son of Laufey, who is the king of the frost giants, some people would even say the Titans, and the son of Our Lady Frigga, who is the wife of Othin, he has a dual nature about him. So he came up with a plan. So the giant said for payment, he wanted to marry Freya, who in some traditions is Venus or Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And so he wanted to marry her in exchange for building the wall around Asgard. And so they gave him a task to do, and if he could do it within that time period, which no one could ever imagine, he could marry Freya. But they didn't really want to marry her to him. So the horse and the man built the wall, and right before he was finished, the gods of Asgard knew that, oh, he's going to meet his obligation. Loki, you made the agreement to marry Freya off to him for us to build this wall to defend ourselves. You get us out of it. So Loki is a shapeshifter. And so what Loki did was he transformed into a mare, a female horse, a beautiful, irresistible mare. And he found the the giant horse who was helping the giant. He found the great horse helping the giant build the walls of Asgard, and the horse, the studded Loki. He impregnated Loki as a female horse and became extremely tired, and they missed their deadline. And so that way, Freya was no longer an option for marriage. The giant did not marry Freya. I think he became very enraged and then tried to attack the gods, and they killed him for assaulting them. And so they got out of the situation of having to marry Freya off to a man that they didn't want to, and they got their wall built. Maybe they had to finish part of it. And so Loki, as a mayor in that form still, gave birth to Sleipnir. And Sleipnir is the famous horse of Othin. He's an eight-legged horse that's able to transverse the entire world tree in all the realms. And Othin can just travel on him that way. And he is, by marriage, the grandson, and by adoption, the grandson of Othin. So he became the horse of Othin, and Loki reformed back to his normal form, his male form, and one of his children is Sleipnir, and Othin rides Sleipnir throughout the entire, what we would say now, the galaxy and the various dimensions that Asgard rules. And so that was someone who came as a result of it. Loki has two other children, the lady Hela, and who was featured in Ragnarok, and and actually three other children, Lady Hela, in Ragnarok, Fenris Wolf, who was also there, the giant wolf, and there is Jotunheimer, or Juhangamir, who is the world serpent. Or some people would say Leviathan, and so, or but the world serpent, the giant serpent around the world. So these are his children that he had, all of them with a woman, except Sleipnir, which he had when he converted into a mare. So these are the stories that are put out there. Um, so this is in one tradition called long talk. So stay with me because it is part of how you would have learned. And if you ever read Plato and Socrates' stories or Plato's stories or Aristotle's, they will go on an aside to teach you a bit about your culture. And Hegel is very specifically a Central Northern European culture that the West has uh, adopted. So perennialism is something that is known to occur again and again, uh, sometimes in different environments. What is often used is the term traditionalism, or specifically the tradition. The ism part of it is usually taken away. So the tradition says that whether you go back to divine Aristotle or you go back to the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Mayan, the Inca, the Iroquois, if you go back to the Chinese or the Japanese, uh, within all of these traditions, within all of these languages, let's say, within all of these colleges, these faculties, you will find the same essential system in place. And every 1,000 years or so, and this is not necessarily the way, it is recodified. So when you're reading Aristotle, which is from divine Plato, lived in 550 around there and lived a long life, 550 BC. So Aristotle was a young student of his. Let's say he lived around 500 BC, and he lived then. Or he may have even lived a little bit later and have studied Plato differently. So he lived then, and what he did was he took everything that Plato put together, and Plato put it together from his studies with Socrates, yes, but also with his grandfather, Solon, who was king of Greece or king of Athens and had studied himself in Egypt. He studied in Egypt, and many people have gone to study at a particular school in Egypt focused on the sun, going back to the story of Balder, and on uh, concepts around solar deities, large scale realities that others, even if they have their own systems, like the Earth has a moon around it, it also goes around the sun. So when you're not the most central person. So the tradition has certain elements that are always there. And when Hegel says, up to the present day, the logic of Aristotle continues to be the received system that, and he'll go on to explain this more, that no matter when you are now, at least since for the last 2,500 years, if you are learning logic, you are learning it from Aristotle, and how he put it together, how his form. This is in large part due to when the West received it and how it made it into English. I've studied Aristotle with Arabic speaking instructors who will read the Arabic and then they will offer a translation into English and an explanation, which I have copied down and or tried to absorb. The Arabs were the ones who kept the Greek texts as they took over, or many of the Greeks became Arabs, mixing in with them, or just took that name. And that those Arabic texts came into Italy and made their way throughout all of Europe, all the way to England, and here now in the United States or wherever you happen to be. They made their way to China and to Japan, to Russia, and to parts of, all parts of the world. And many of them were codified in Northern Africa in that process. And so, of course, made their way down the Nile River to Ethiopia and other places. So the tradition or the received system is the one thing that we've all studied. And there is a way over time that you will notice it. And so this concept of knowing is, if you study Plato's Republic traditionally, you'll get to the very end of it, and the most of the normal translations that you get, a Penguin edition and your average or even high-end university possibly, it'll be the Republic of Plato. You'll go through all his forms, and you'll be told at the very end, as I was in my political philosophy course by an excellent professor at UCLA, God rest his soul, Victor Wolfenstein. He said at the end, Plato says, this entire system that I've set up here is really geared, and it works and you should follow it, but it's geared toward a particular goal. And that goal I can give a name, and it's called the good. But the good is not explainable. It is only an experience. And that experience is something that you know when it approaches you or when it dawns on you. And some people argue that an individual can have that experience. Others would argue, as some Buddhists, so you have um, the Theravada Buddhists who say you can experience nirvana on your own, and others say that even if you do, you really can't experience it completely until everyone experiences it. And so there are different ways to approach it, but the good is an experience. So the tradition in recognizing it is an experience. So I can see it in words, but has it taken place yet? And so if it hasn't yet, then it is theoretically not possible for me to know it completely. And if it has, then this that we're doing now is part of the traditional process to get there. Uh, so I'll return to the text. Up to the present day, the logic of Aristotle continues to be the received system. It has indeed been spun out to greater length, especially by the laborers of the medieval schoolmen who, without making any material additions, merely refined in details. The moderns also have left their mark upon this logic, partly by omitting many points of logical doctrine due to Aristotle and the schoolmen, and partly by foisting in a quantity of psychological matter. The purport of the science is to become acquainted with the procedure of finite thought, and if it is adapted to its presupposed object, the science is entitled to be styled correct. The study of this formal logic undoubtedly has its uses. It sharpens the wits, as the phrase goes, and teaches us to collect our thoughts and to abstract. Whereas in common and abstract, some people know that as salve. Whereas in common consciousness, we have to deal with sensuous conceptions which cross and perplex. Whereas in common consciousness, we have to deal with sensuous conceptions which cross and perplex one another. Abstraction, moreover, implies the concentration of the mind on a single point, coagula, and thus induces the habit of attending to our inward selves. An acquaintance with the forms of finite thought may be made a means of training the mind for the empirical sciences, since their method is regulated by these forms, and in this sense logic has been designated instrumental. It is true, we may be still more liberal and say logic is to be studied not for its utility, but for its own sake. The super excellent is not to be sought for the sake of mere utility. The super excellent is not to be sought for the sake of mere utility. In one sense, this is quite correct, but it may be replied that the super excellent is also the most useful, because it is the all sustaining principle which, having a subsistence of its own, may therefore serve as the vehicle of special ends which it furthers and secures. And thus special ends, though they have no right to be set first, are still fostered by the presence of the highest good. Religion, for instance, has an absolute value of its own, yet at the same time other ends flourish and succeed in its train. As Christ says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Particular ends can be attained only in the attainment of what absolutely is and exists in its own right.